on behalf of the English Department of St. Xavier's College to welcome you warmly to this RUSA-sponsored webinar cum workshop on the creative, complex joy of translation studies. We welcome our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, who always inspires us to undertake new endeavors. We welcome all the faculty, our colleagues from other faculties of other colleges, and our speakers, particularly Dr. Meenakshi Shivram, Dr. Sangeeta Sanyal, who made this webinar possible. Welcome to all our participants who, by their presence, inspire us with so much joy. On the theme of translation, I wonder if there's anybody among us who has never turned our efforts to translating a piece of work from one language to another. Again, I wonder if there isn't anybody who has not encountered the challenge of translating the nuances of one language into the medium of another. Again, I wonder if there isn't anybody who, in the process of translation, has not been faced with that awkward moment where they're about to introduce a nuance of their own thought in the process of translating the thought of an author from one language to another. For all of us, this will be an instructive and an enriching webinar. Translation is a very useful skill and one that we hope to hone and to develop new perspectives on through the course of these 2 enriching days. May we have a very fruitful experience. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, to inaugurate this session. And I also invite him to speak a few words.
Okay, actually, the translation, I remember when I started my career as a teacher here, knowing Marathi was advantage to me. And Father Emil used to ask me to translate all Marathi circulars coming in Marathi to be translated into English. And tough job. I was doing that job for almost 10 years and I used to get 100 rupees honorarium for that translation work. So that was one encounter of mine with doing translation. And then I started doing translation of my own research work, which was Latin into English. So that was another headache. And just today morning, I heard my wife telling me, who is a mathematics teacher, she's been asked to translate board paper, HSC board question paper, to be translated into Marathi. And though we speak Marathi at home, to find the parallel words in Marathi, it is headache. Anyway, that's a personal note. Respected Professor Shivram, Dr. Sanyal, Dr. Pearl Pastakia, the head of the English department, my colleagues from St. Xavier's, and colleges from Mumbai and outside Mumbai, retired faculty, students, and alumni. Warm greetings from St. Xavier's College. I'm happy to inaugurate this RUSA-sponsored webinar cum workshop titled The Creative Complex Joy of Translation, the Introduction to Translation Studies, organized by our own Department of English. The English department, little bit about the department. The English department started with the college in the year 1869. So it's almost 152 years old. As old as our college, which with a rich legacy of faculty and alumni who have made great impact. I understand translation studies is an important and relevant subject, especially in a country as diverse as ours. The linguistic diversity of our country is a reason to be proud of. Every language variant is of great value. However, due to the lack of fluency in regional languages, our access to those languages is difficult. For instance, a Marathi speaker will not understand Tamil or Assamese unless it is translated. Similarly, the text from English uh, to a regional language and vice versa is also a significant aspect of knowledge creation and knowledge production. As a botanist, as I just mentioned, I have had to rely on translated texts from for my research, which was Latin to English. Most of the botany research is written in Latin. Had it not been for those translations, I would have been deprived of some world-class material in the field of botany. I salute those translators who made that reading material accessible by translating it for people like me. Translators have a difficult job. Creative translators ensure that they preserve the meaning of the text, and yet at the same time, they cannot have word for word translation. Translators get enriched in the process of the translation because every language is rooted in a certain cultural ethos. In Marathi, we say "bara kosavar bara bhasha badalte." As you travel, every 12 miles, there is a variation in the local language, in Marathi as well. So, bara kosavar bhasha badalte, which means every 12 miles variation appears in the same language. All of us will agree that within the same region, language has differences. Therefore, the task of the translator is challenging because he or she has to ensure that the language is translated to reflect its varied tones. It is a creative and complex process. As the first part of today's title suggests, I'm sure translation studies is a pertinent area of research. And with the hands-on experience that you will receive in this webinar today, I sincerely hope your interest in translating different works will receive fresh encouragement from the experts. I wish each of you, faculty, students, and others, the very best in this webinar come workshop. Thank you, Pearl, for inviting me, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Enjoy your webinar.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Next time, I hope to see you on campus, both ma'ams, Sanyal ma'am and Shivram ma'am.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. On that note, I'd take this opportunity to introduce our resource person for today, Dr. Meenakshi Shivram. I'm extremely privileged because I was ma'am's student exactly for 2 lectures. And thereafter, ma'am moved to another institution. So in the 11th grade, I was under her guidance for two lectures, and I still remember those lectures. So thank you, ma'am, firstly, for being here with us. Dr. Meenakshi Shivram teaches at Christ University, the Department of English and Cultural Studies. She has earlier taught postgraduate courses at Mumbai University, SNDT University, and Chennai University. She has reviewed literature-related books for newspapers and journals, has contributed to the Routledge Encyclopedia of Postcolonial Literatures. Her areas of interest are fiction and philosophy, in particular, Indian Bhakti poetry. She's also a trained executive coach and works with organizations like Asian Paints and Volkswagen. She's a translator from Hindi to English, and the best part is she's won a Sahitya Academy Award for one of her translations. We're extremely honored to have you with us, ma'am, and I'm sure we will have a great time. So, a very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Uh, thank you for the invitation, Dr. Shin, to St. Xavier's College, but I'm glad virtually here to be talking to your students and to many others who have joined in. Thank you for the platform that you have given to me. Thank you, Dr. Pearl Pastakia, on behalf of your department. And of course, my student for 2 hours, Rashmi. I'm so glad to connect with you again over here. So thanks to also my ex-colleague Anjali Bhelande, who I think put us together, who suggested my name for some other program. And then I walked into this one. So thanks to all of you. And I will start my talk today. Am I good to go?
Yes, yes, please. Thank you so much.
All right. So the talk for translation studies, and both Dr. Pastakia and Dr. Shinde have spoken about one, the diversity that is available and the complexity that goes with it. So there are just these two words that are usually used with translation studies, how complex it is. I really like the word headache. You know, the headache that translation can mean to a person who is translating. And there are these kinds, right? There are these academic textbooks that one translates and the literary texts that one translates. So the talk is on translation studies, and this is now an academic discipline. And there are many aspects to translation studies. For instance, one can look at the origins of translation. We can look at the history of translation studies, or we can look at who are the earliest translators. What is the original meaning of the word translation, for instance? Or one could study methodologies in translation. Is it transliteration? Is it free translation? Or one could study the politics of translation. As in, who are the writers who get published, right? Who are the writers who get translated and who have greater chance of getting translated and promoted through that? Nowadays, the word translation also has multiple other meanings, right? Adaptation, subtitling, all that is seen as translation. Homeland to diaspora literature is seen as translation. Computers and AI, they are agencies of translation. Emojis are seen as translation text. So this discourse of translation is huge. The canvas is really very broad. Today, my focus is not on any of these areas. Right? So that's really for a classroom that's very academic, and you can pick that up from there. So I am not focusing on any of these areas. My focus in my talk is a kind of a recounting of a very personal journey. It's about, so the objective of this talk is really not to theorize, but to explore what I theorized along with you, right? So it's theory, but I don't know how else to approach translation except through the personal medium and the personal encounter. So I want to share with you the joys of translation and also the perils of translating, not the pains so much as the dangers of translating. So I will talk about the novel for which I got the translation award, but I will also be talking about a text that I have taught in translation, a text that I have read in English, available in translation. So there are three parts to my talk. I will begin with one short poem that is available from the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is historically the oldest text available in human history. So I will take a very short poem. It's called The Creation Myth. I look it's been translated. The varieties of translation possibilities that are available from that very short poem. The second part is about the novel that I have translated and my experience of translating. And the third part, which is the part of the talk today, is about this baggage and the burden of translation, which we call or associate with the name of culture, right? The cultural baggage of translation, and what it has meant to me, actually, to translate a novel like Topi Shukla, the one that I have translated, right? And I'm going to talk about today. There are other texts that I have translated, but I am hoping really to look at these three broad areas and to use that one text to show how I approached that topic 20 years ago and how I read that book again now. I was telling Rashmi, thank you for asking me to reread my book, because I was a totally different translator 20 years after having translated that work. So I'm going to that poem from the Rig Veda. This is also a workshop. I don't know how one can do a workshop with 140 participants, but I'm going to try in the end to leave you with a few sample examples so that you can try translating and share, if possible, your own experiences of translating something. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at the poem. Rashmi, can you see this?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, yes, it's visible.
I've given this a title, right? It's called The Pot at the End of the Rainbow, which
Yes.
this is what one expects at the end of translation studies. Really, there is no pot of gold. In very literal terms, also, there is no money for translating. I think your principal was very lucky, very fortunate, very privileged to get those 100 rupees for the tough work that he did. There is no pot at the end of the rainbow, the pot of gold, but there is that journey, that arc that you cover. And I've just titled it a mirage called cultural transference. But that's like a conclusion to my paper. Is it a mirage? And can culture be spurred through language? What are we attempting when we say that we are translating? So here is a poem. It's a short the Rig Veda, Mandala 10, hymn 129. So the word hymn, I mean, I don't think that's the right word at all for this particular poem. It's not a hymn. But can you see how when you look at translation, you think, oh, it's from the Rig Veda, religious text, and therefore hymn. And that word comes very naturally when people talk about this particular poem. And they say it's the creation poem, right? So I'm just going to call it the creation poem. I'm giving it a title. It doesn't have a title. And I'm going to assume that we don't know Sanskrit. I don't know Sanskrit, right? You know, many of us may not know Sanskrit, but for now, I'll just say that this is what Sanskrit looks like a little bit in Hindi, and this is what it looks like. And I know that it is na asad na asin, you know, it's going on like that in a tone, but this has been translated into English. I have no access to the original. So how do I get to know it? I will know it only because the translation is available in the language that I am familiar with, which is English. So, so great translations are available. But look at what happens. There are many people who have translated, right? I am going to just look at some top translators. And here is one by Ralph Griffith. This is the one that I am going to read because I'll take a few lines from many others, but I will focus on these, right? On this particular poem. I'll read it out first so that you can also appreciate what this poem is about. So this is about a time, you know, this poem is really so complex. Where do I begin? So this is about what was there before there was the world, right? I know in science we talk about the big theory, but what does the Rig Veda tell us about it? When there was no world, what was there? So was there always creation, or was there a point when creation began? And all our religious texts have different takes on it, and this is what the Rig Veda says. The Rig Veda, we think it says, because the translation is the only source available for us, it says that then, meaning at that point in time, there was neither existence nor non-existence. Non-existent nor existence. There was no air, there was no sky. What covered in and where? What gave shelter? Was water there? Unfathomed depth of water? Okay. Look at this. Do you see any question mark anywhere here? Look at the punctuation. Punctuation, single line and double line, which is a punctuation that you get in Sanskrit. We've completely done away with it when we are looking at the English translation, and we have our punctuations then. So what was there before there was the world? There was no death. There was nothing called immortal. No sign was there, the days and night divider. That one thing, breathless, breathed by its own nature. Apart from it was nothing whatsoever. So there was just that one thing. And what was it? It was breathless. Darkness there was. Concealed in darkness, this all was indiscriminate chaos. All that existed then was void and formless. By the great power of warmth was born the unit. So how was this born, the world? The first thing we say is there was warmth, and that's how it was born. So you need warm, right? Now you can use different words for warmth. You can look at heat, and therefore the world came into being. Thereafter rose desire. Thereafter, desire in the beginning. Desire, the primal seed and germ of spirit. Sages who searched within their heart's thought discovered the existence in non-existent. I think this person has made it difficult because the assumption is Sanskrit is difficult, philosophy is difficult, and then you. So look at these lines, right? Sages who searched with their heart's thought. So the thoughts that happen in one's heart, not the feelings, but the heart's thought. And they are sages. They discovered the relationship between existence and non-existence. Transversely was their severing line extended. I doubt if transversely was used at all in Sanskrit, but you have it here. Transversely was their severing line extended. What was above it then and what below it? There were begetters, there were mighty forces, free action here, and energy up yonder. So there was a dividing line, and then you had something above it and something below it. Who verily knows, and who can here declare it, whence it was born and whence comes this creation? The gods are later than this world's production. This is like Rig Veda, and I want you to know that it says that we came first and came. Who knows then whence it first came into being? He, the first origin of this creation, whether he formed it all or did not form it, whose eye controls this world in highest heaven, he verily knows it, or perhaps he knows not. So that's the poem. Technically, the poem is saying we don't know how the world was created. But perhaps there was warmth, there was desire, desire of the universe to be born. And perhaps there is a God. And then it says that, did God create it? No, God came after the world was created. The gods are later than this world's production. And so last line is this, look, perhaps there was a God who created it, but does the God know? Does the God have an answer? Perhaps gods too don't have an answer. Who knows? Is how the poem ends, right? Who knows whether the gods created it or they didn't create it, or who created it. So that's that poem from the Rig Veda, and this is one translation that we have looked at. Now I look at the same poem and I pick up a few lines to see how others have translated it. You know, these are big names. So this is what Griffith has said, and we saw that now. Sages who searched with their heart's thought. Look at what Wendy Doniger says. I'm assuming that Wendy Doniger is a name that many of us are familiar with. She was in news about 2 years ago for having translated Sanskrit texts and for having therefore mistranslated Sanskrit texts, right? So she was in the news. Wendy Doniger says, desire came upon that one in the beginning. That was the first seed of mind. And she says, poets seeking in their heart with wisdom. Look at this. Sages who searched with their heart's thought. And here it's poets. So there is something in that word which is combining wisdom with the sage and with the poet. So you have poets seeking in their heart with wisdom, not heart's thought. So thought becomes wisdom. They found the same bond, right? Existence and non-existence. Then we have Max Muller, big name in translation. Then first came love upon it. Here she says desire. Max Muller says love. So what was that word which meant love to some reader and desire to some other reader? Then first came love upon it, the new spring of mind. Poets in their hearts discerned, pondering this bond between created things. So he says poets. All right, now there are Indians too who have translated it. There is Bhashyam, another line, right? Below was strength. Remember there was the line and then something above and something below. So below was strength, over it was impulse, says Bhashyam. Wendy Doniger says there was impulse beneath and there was giving forth above. And Wilson, one translator, it's the same line, okay? That translator says, some were shredders of seed, others were mighty. Food was inferior, the eater was superior. Now, how did he arrive at this? Food was inferior, below. The eater was superior, above. And then you have Max Muller, he says, then seeds were sown and mighty power arose. Nature below, power and will above. Look at that. Bhashyam says above was impulse. Max Muller says above was power and will. Bhashyam says below was strength. Max Muller says below was nature. Below was impulse, says Wendy Doniger. Now, what was below? What was... If you look at the translation possibilities that are available over here, one thing we will know is that they don't know what they are talking about. And therefore, we don't know how we are going to ever reach that. But we have a rough idea, right? That there is the seed of desire. Perhaps there is the seed. I don't even know if that word seed exists because some people use it, some don't. There is desire, there is love, there is warmth, there is heat. And then we look at one last part again, which I find interesting. He, the first origin of this creation, whether he formed it all or did not form it, whose eyes controls this world in the highest heaven, he verily knows it, or perhaps he knows not. Max Muller says, this is Griffith, right? Max Muller says, who knows from whence this great creation sprang? 2 lines over here, 5 lines over here. He from whom all this great creation came, whether his will created or was mute. The most high seer that is in highest heaven. So highest heaven is there. And here it says whose eye controls, that becomes the most high seer. The most high seer that is in highest heaven, he knows it. Or perchance even he knows not. Then we have, none knoweth whence creation has arisen, and whether he has or has not produced it. He who surveys it in the highest heaven, he only knows. Or haply, he may know not. So we get this idea that the last line is where everybody is agreeing with, right? Perhaps he knows, perhaps he doesn't know. Bhashyam says, since all creation had its origin, he, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not, he who surveys it from all highest heaven, he knows, or maybe even he doesn't know. Okay, so we've roughly got an idea. But why I have shown you this bit, one line and how it gets translated, or one idea, and the role of the translator is because of this word iyam. Iyam is the word that is used in Sanskrit in the poem. And iyam means this one. In some other contexts, it can be used as referring to a woman, this woman, right? But never male, it's this. It's neither male nor female. It is this. But look at all the translators who got the he. There is a God, and the God is a he. But that's not what the poem is saying. So how much of the translator seeps into that translated product? So in my mind, the translator is a he. That the creator is a he. And therefore, in this case, the translator is also a he. I don't know why the translator would not. Sorry. May I continue, Rashmi? Is that?
Yes, please. May we request all of you to please mute yourselves? Yeah,
I think there was a question already. We'll wait for the questions because I'm just going to share my slides and then come back to you. I don't like sharing slides, but there was no other way in which I could have shown this to you, demonstrated to you that there is this word he created. Maybe he knows, maybe he doesn't know, but the original does not have that word. That word he, that gender related word he is not there in the original text. So where did it come from? Translator after translator. And we see that, right? When I'm teaching literature, and I said this in another talk, when we talk about bhakti poetry, the word bhakta, the devotee, right? The devout person. In its whatever manifestation, original manifestation, the bhakta is without gender. You may be able to connect it with how people talk about those who like Narendra Modi or Narendra Modi bhakts. It is not a female bhakt or a male bhakt. That does not have a gender. That word does not carry with it the implication of a gender. Yet when we go to classroom, we say male bhakti poets and female bhakti poets. Now, when did we start talking like this? Because bhakt is bhakt. And in this poem, there is this one. It's not a he or a she. But translator after translator says either he knows or he doesn't know. But we don't ponder about it, right? We are looking at, oh, it's the myth of creation and where did that come from? So we are willing to suspend that doubt. Having said that about the Rigveda, to merely show to you how many possibilities are available and how can we even approach the original text, I don't think all of us will have the patience to read so many versions and then arrive at it. The only other option would be to learn Sanskrit, but who is that Sanskrit teacher who can tell us, right? What is right or what is not right? So with that, I move on to the second part of my talk, which is this novel that I have translated. And if you can see me in your chat, this is the book. Topi Shukla. This is the book. This is the novel. This is the novel written by Dr. Rahi Masoom Raza. I'll talk to you about him very soon. But first about the novel, a strange title, Topi. For those of us who are from Bombay or from the Hindi belt would know Topi is a cap. He's Topi Shukla, but there are lots of phrases associated with Topi, right? Kisi ko topi pehnana. It's a Hindi novel. Topi pehnana is to make a fool of someone. But he's called Topi Shukla. Topi Shukla, the story is about two friends, one Hindu and one Muslim. What happens to a pre-partition society, what happens to their friendship in a post-partition society? Is that friendship allowed to blossom? Does that friendship remain? Or what happens? What is the conclusion of that story? And how do they meet as little children and then as grown adults, right? So how were they when they met as children? Did they know Hindu, Muslim? It's what can I say? A beautiful story. It's a story that all of us must read at some point or the other, because beyond translation is that world that we have to arrive at, the writer's world, right? So I'm going to talk to you about Topi Shukla. I'll begin with translation areas, right? So I'll begin with these words that I struggled with, and a lot of people do that. So in Hindi, they would say, baat ye hai ki, and the novel is filled with that, baat ye hai ki. So you translate that into the thing is that. Now, those who are, scholars in the English language will treat this as an Indianism, but my book is filled with it. I didn't know what to do with baat ye hai. So kya baat hai? The thing is that, So I stuck with the thing is that I didn't drop it. I stuck with it. Then filled with are yaar. Now I'm putting in the tone. Remember, in the book, there is no tone, but there is array. I've kept it as array. Those of us who can understand array will understand array. There is no other way that I can talk about it. And then there is the two ways. There are the two ways in which the word bhai has been. One is bhai. Arey bhai. You know, like you say, ama yaar, arey bhai. And the other is bhai, like for a brother. And both are used in the novel. So in my own mind, now this is really about 22 years ago that I translated. So what I did was I said, this capital B is bhai. In my mind, that was bhai. And this was bhai. Like I wanted people to know there's a difference. And little did I know that people would look at this as inconsistency. But it wasn't an inconsistency. It was really, one is to be said a little differently. And I tried different spellings, right? BHY, BHI is B. So I stuck to BHAI then. I said, okay, bhai, let it be. Then there's an interesting, this novel was tough because it is about language. It is about Hindi and about Urdu. It also has dialects in it. And I had to put all of that into English. So there is this boy, his name is Balbhadra Narayan Shukla. And that's supposed to be a tongue twister. So his name is Balbhadra Narayan Shukla. And he fails in the 8th standard because once there was an election, his father was standing in the election. So there was a lot of activity in the house. He couldn't study. He failed the 8th standard. He's the hero of our story. And the next year, he has typhoid. He fails again. The 3rd year, he says, typhoid ya typhoid ka baap. I am going to clear this exam. That was a beautiful phrase, right? Typhoid ya typhoid ka baap. I said, and I wrote it as typhoid or typhoid's father. And that's like a little thing, but I wanted that flavor out. Didn't look good, so translated it into typhoid or whatever. But that's not what the writer is saying. He says, typhoid ya typhoid ka baap. Very clearly he says it. And why is this important? Because a few pages later, there is a discussion about this country, right? Topi Shukla, Balbhadra Narayan Shukla goes to Aligarh Muslim University to study. I'll tell you about that. He goes to Aligarh Muslim University to study, and he has all these Hindu, Muslim, Sikh friends. He has many of them over there, and they're always, and communists, and they are always talking about who does this country belong to. Shukla is very clear that it belongs to the Hindus and it doesn't belong to the Muslims because Pakistan has already been made for the Muslims, right? Soon after partition, this is the talk. So another Hindu guy tells him, the way you ask this, whose country is it, right? As if your father owns the country. To which Topi Shukla says, if it is not my father's, then what do you think? That it belongs to your father, right? So this whole idea of property and patriarchal senses of ownership. If there is property, who does it belong to someone's father? I wanted that connected somehow with typhoid ya typhoid ka baap. I wanted the father thing to come up over there. But then you compromised and then you put it down over there and you just said, like, you know, but this was interesting. Who does the country belong to? Your father? No, then what? Your father. And they are young adults who are fighting about it. There is a mushaira and there is a kavi sammelan. This is Hindu and this is Muslim. This is Hindi and this is Urdu. Muslim is not, Urdu is not a Muslim language. Hindi is not a Hindu language. But look at how this language works out. What do you do when you're dealing with it in English? You just call both of them a poetry conference or something like that. I forget what I have called it, but you know, how do you show that they're talking about the split in the language over here, where once upon a time, everybody used to go to the mushaira and everybody used to go to the Kavi Sammelan, but at the university now, you have a mushaira separate from the Kavi Sammelan. So somewhere I have kept the words, somewhere I have translated it. And one of the questions that translators always ask is, should we have footnotes? Are footnotes bridges to meaning or are they the blocks to meaning? And one last, the kinds of dreams that the Muslim youth were dreaming. People would think this is an Indianism and this is not a right way to translate, but that was on page 57. And on the next page, I say what kinds of dreams they had. Obviously, because the writer has used two different phrases. Difficult to know this, right? Unless you're reading it so closely. Now, this little boy, whose name is Balbhadra Narayan Shukla, he meets his friend Iffan, I-F-F-A-N, Iffan. And Balbhadra cannot pronounce Iffan, he pronounces it as Ifan. So I-F-A-N and I-F-F-A-N, right? Iffan and Iffan, that is Iffan. That's the way in which the spellings have been mentioned in the book. And when he meets that friend, that dialogue I will share a little later, but over here, he used to wonder what the word Ammi meant. Now I had to retain Ammi. So if you are from this context and this cultural background, you would know that it's perhaps in a Muslim house, perhaps, right, that people call their mothers Ammi. And it took the boy some time. Then he understood that they called Mataji Ammi. So can you imagine here, both words have just mother, mother, mom, maybe what? What can I do in English if I can't retain those words? So I had to retain the Ammi and the Mataji over here. And one day at home, by mistake, he calls his mother Ammi. The Hindu boy calls his mother Ammi, and the mother is so furious. And she says, where did you pick this labs from? Now, labs is an Urdu word. In Hindi, you would say shabd. And the mother slips into Urdu. The Hindu mother slips into Urdu and she says, where did you pick this labs from? And the boy says, labs? What's labs, ma? What do you do with these words? Right? Unless you put them within brackets, because labs is labs. It's a word. Where did you pick up this word from? Will not communicate that the Hindu mother had used an Urdu word. Right? It will not communicate that. So it's a very tough novel in that sense to look at, which brings me to the politics of representation. So our hero, Balbhadra Narayan Shukla, he grows up and he decides that the Aligarh Muslim University is funded by the government, to which a lot of Hindus pay taxes. And why should only Muslims go to that university? Why can't other people go to the university? So he goes to the Muslim university. This is strange and funny because when he's with the Hindus, he's seen as a Muslim. When he's with the Muslims, he's seen as a Hindu. And that's the idea, right, about this complex personality that Topi represents. So at the Aligarh Muslim University, in the students committee, which is a boisterous student committee, whenever you wanted to say something, you had to stand up to speak and you had to have the topi on your head, the skull cap, right, that Muslim young men wear. So you had to wear that. Balbhadra didn't have it. So at the student committee, if he wanted to say something, the students would not let him speak. They would say topi, 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 topi. They would keep on shouting that word. They would go on shouting that word topi, insisting that he wear the topi before he speaks. So once when he really wanted to speak, he picks up the topi from another student's head and he puts it on his own head and starts talking. But which means then the students can't bully him, right? They didn't find that funny enough. So then they started shouting topi, topi, topi again. Then now take out your topi and talk. So in the university, his name became, from Balbhadra Narayan Shukla, it became Topi Shukla. Now, apparently the writer tells us that this is based on a real life event, that this person, the Topi Shukla person, whoever it represents, is real. And that person has also acknowledged it in the book, right? And the introduction to the book says, I am Topi Shukla and the book is on me. So this is real. Some parts of it is real. So we look at this politics, the Hindu-Muslim identity and how that gets represented in the novel. So we have young boys, right? Iffan and Topi Shukla have just met. They are about 7 or 8 years old. And Iffan calls Topi to his house. And then Iffan's father says in the house, Iffan Mia, get him something to eat, said the man. The man is actually Iffan's father, but this is being told to us from Topi's point of view. Topi doesn't know who the man is. And Topi is coming for the first time into this house. So Ifan Mia, get him something to eat. And Topi says, you are Mia. And Ifan, Mia. Ifan is also stunned by that word. And what does it mean to Topi? He says, you are a Muslim? All right. Now, Mia is a Muslim. This is the word for a Muslim. You are a Mia. Mia means you're a Muslim, even if Ifan didn't know it. Right. And someone who knows English well will say, are you Muslim? But this is the dialect that he speaks. And therefore, I had to switch into this kind of a incorrect English to point out the dialect, which says, you are Muslim? That little boy is asking, right? That little Hindu boy. So Ifan says, yes. And these people, there are a lot of other people in the house. Right? So Ifan says, this is my Abu, my Ammi, and my Dada. I not ask that. Are these people also Muslim? So a child's idea that you may be Muslim, but are your parents also Muslim? Is everyone around you Muslim? The exposure that for the first time he's come into a Mia's house, and what will his own parents say about it? All this is happening in Lucknow. Then the representation that is happening as Topi is growing up. These are the problematic areas, right? How do you translate a book like this? How do you read a book like this? Topi, that is Topi also met a few people during that time as he was growing up. These people would bring all the boys from the neighborhood together and teach them wrestling, teach them to march, to do tricks with batons, and generally talk to them. So we know in a very indirect kind of a way, this is the RSS that is being talked about. And Topi is being brought into the loop of the RSS team. All of a sudden, Topi found himself getting closer to these people. They took him into their fold with open arms. Then when he learned that these people belonged to the party that had killed, sorry for the error, that had killed Gandhiji, he got scared. How does a reader read it today? How will you read it today? That here is a Muslim writer who's very clearly saying that Gandhiji was killed by the RSS, and this is what the RSS is. They are people who teach you wrestling, they teach you to march. This is how they are. I don't know how the reader will pick it up today. So this is what is mentioned in the book, and the joy with which I translated the book, and the pain with which I reflect, the fear with which I reflect on how this book will be received today, are the two things that I will also look at as a concluding part to my talk. Because there was this world of the Hindu and the Muslim, which the writer is trying so hardly, he's trying so hard to hold on to that ideal world. Now this is Topi Shukla as he's grown up, and he is meeting Ifan again after many years. Ifan takes him home. Ifan is a professor at Aligarh Muslim University. Topi, because he has failed in his classes, is still studying, and he has enrolled himself in Aligarh Muslim University. He's doing his research, and Ifan is already married. So you have Topi meeting Ifan's wife Sakina for the first time. Now, don't ever ask me to eat here, Topi said after he had finished eating. Hindu eating in a Muslim's house. Right? Why? Sakina's beautiful eyebrows became tense. Are bhai, explain this to her, Topi told Ifan. I am a very staunch Hindu. I too am a very staunch Muslim, said Sakina. After you leave, I will scrub these utensils hard. So, if I had not eaten, these utensils would not have been scrubbed neat. This is why I say that Muslims are dirty, said Topi. I don't know how you, my young listeners, are responding to this, but this is supposed to be humorous. And I shared that humor with the writer. This is funny. Look at the openness with which they are talking. Ifan's wife and Topi. The joy that they have in meeting after so many years, and Sakina saying, you are a Hindu, I'm a Muslim, talking so openly about it and sharing whatever they wanted to. And Topi saying, I will never again eat. Today I'm eating, but the next time I will not eat because I get polluted. Making fun of all these things. How do we read it today? What is it that has happened from the time that the writer wrote the novel? Or is the writer creating an artificial world where the writer believes that this kind of a relationship is possible, but that society doesn't let it exist? So you have this very difficult Hindu-Muslim relationship that is being navigated here through a story. And look at the tone in the text. Topi Shukla speaks very poor Urdu. For instance, Urdu speakers are very proud about their sounds and about the softness of their sounds. They make a difference between a j and a z. So if someone's name is Zargam, you can't call them Jargam. If someone's name is Murtaza, you can't call it a Murtaja. They're very fond of their sounds. Topi doesn't have, is not very fond of saying the word correctly. He's not bothered about language so much, about the purity of language. So Sakina and Ifan, they have a 5-year-old daughter, Shabnam. And Topi is talking to that daughter. He's speaking some wrong words that he is saying. And Sakina says, Topi, for Allah's sake, don't ruin my child's tongue, right? With your wrong pronunciation. And Topi says, why should I do anything for your Allah's sake? I've sent him away to Pakistan. Okay. Do you see the humor? Do you see the humor, or what do you see? Right? It's so beautiful, this novel, because this is the friendship that is being talked about over here. And before I move on to my last part, I just want to tell you over here that it's difficult for us to imagine what happens to Topi at the end of the story, at the end of this narrative. There are lines that I am going to pick up and to show to you what exactly happens. What is Rahi Masoom Raza trying to tell us? That's the name of the writer, right? Why is Rahi Masoom Raza writing like this? To show this openness between two people, and then and what happens to that friendship, and how the novel concludes, right? All this I will lead to you and to your imagination. I'll leave you to read the book whenever you find the time. But the reader today, you are also translating and decoding the text in your own times. How do you decode it? Look at this particular passage. Ifan's drawing room was a largely plain one. Over the artificial fireplace was a bust of Shankar. Have you snared Shankar thinking him to be Bhola? Ifan smiled and said, I hate the Hindus, but I love Shankar, because he is exactly like human beings, stupid, drinking the poison alone. Shiv, Socrates, Christ, alone. Now, the context, you have to know the context in which this being said, but I am pointing it out even without the bigger context, that why does Ifan's drawing room have a bust of Shankar? Now, those of us who are familiar with the names will know that Shankar, Bholenath, Bhola, Shiv are all names of that one God, right? They're different names of that one form. And there are so many multiple forms of gods within Hinduism. So, why would Ifan keep a bust of Shankar? I sometimes feel the writer is trying so hard. The writer is trying so hard to tell us that, this Hindu-Muslim tag is unfair. And you have this Topi asking, why have you kept Shankar? You thought he was a Bhola. So he is punning on the word Bhola. The book is filled with puns. I've not talked to you about it, but it's filled with puns and I didn't know what to do with them. Bhola, a simpleton. Have you kept Shankar over here thinking him to be a simpleton? And Ifan saying, I hate Hindus. Can you say that today? And he's saying that to a Hindu friend. And he says, I love Shankar. You know why? I like this God, but he doesn't say God. I like Shankar because he's stupid. Can we say that? I don't know how many of you are already getting hurt. But what is this writer doing over here? I want you to know that the writer is talking about stupidity as why did he drink that poison alone when that the ocean was being churned? So here I want to tell you about Rahi Masoom Raza. One more slide, and then Rahi Masum Raza. So this is happening in the Aligarh Muslim University campus, in the canteen area, in the cafeteria, which I've heard St. Xavier's College has a beautiful cafeteria. So it's a place where minds meet. So over here, somebody is talking, right? And that person is saying, this university is not scared of the Hindus, but is scared of the communists. Dr. Zakir Hussain speaks of an age-old rivalry. There is no department where these communists have not seeked in. Like this looks like today, right? When we're talking about universities and left and the right in the university. There is no department where these communists have not seeked in. Look at Allah's grace that the girls of a Muslim university are seen dancing, and Antony and Cleopatra is being staged in the name of culture. So this is not an offensive remark in the book at all. It is not offensive. Okay, so this is being said like this. So KP Singh, look at the name. So with the name, you know that this is a non-Muslim name. KP Singh says, this is an absolutely wrong thing to do. Muslim girls should stage only Laila Majnu and Shiri Farhad. You know, they can't do Antony Cleopatra. These are young boys, young men who are joking and laughing. And they say that Muslim girls cannot do anything but Laila Majnu and Shiri Farhad. And then the next line says, boys from the other tables nearby started laughing. From among those who laughed, the Muslims laughed more than the Hindus. Now, I am a Hindu translator to a Muslim writer, and I'm wondering, why did the writer write this? What was the writer? You know, I share this so deeply with the writer today as I'm reading it. I know what the writer is trying to say, but I don't know how the book will be received. Why is he so desperate to tell us that the Muslims were tolerant of these kinds of remarks? What was that need? What made him say that? And how are we going to read this novel, right? So many years after it was written. So why is this important? This Hindu-Muslim talk and how openly Rahi Masum Raza is talking about it is because there was a serial, many of you were not born at that time, but you may have heard about it, the Mahabharata being screened on television on Doordarshan. That time we had only Doordarshan, and pretty much the entire nation and our neighboring country, Pakistan, stopped on Sunday, either 9 to 10 or 10 to 11. Everybody froze, everybody sat in front of their televisions to watch this mega epic serial, Mahabharata. It's a B.R. Chopra production. And when B.R. Chopra was making the Mahabharata, he wanted a dialogue writer. And he chose Dr. Rahi Masum Raza to be the dialogue writer. You can imagine the controversy at that time. We did not have any of these social media platforms, so it was muted in that sense. We only got to know about it from the newspapers or from the radio. But there was a lot of anguish over in a land of so many Hindus. Isn't there Hindu scholarship that you have to depend on a Muslim man to write dialogues for a Hindu epic? Okay, that was the controversy. B.R. Chopra did not budge. He continued with the dialogue writer. So this was before it was being aired. All this controversy was there. And then episode 1 was aired and episode 2 was aired. That's one Sunday and then the next Sunday. And by the time that next Sunday came, this entire controversy just died. Its own natural death. Because the nation started saying that no one else could have written the dialogues like this. For those of you who remember, who have seen it or who have heard about it from people older than you, you know that the mother was called Mata Shri, the father was called Pita Shri, and the brother was called Bhrata Shri. And these became household words. You know, when we had to make fun of someone, say Mata Shri, Pita Shri, we started talking like that. Like when Amitabh Bachchan came on that episode, you know, whatever, Kaun Banega Crorepati, when he said, lock kiya jaye. And little children used to say, lock kiya jaye, lock kiya jaye. So this is how popular the dialogues became. And then what was that Muslim man doing, writing the dialogues of the Mahabharata? Because that artist's mind is not Hindu or Muslim. How do we tell this to people? How do we convey this? And what can translation do? You know, and if this translation is weak, if it is poor, or if the original writer is not received, the original text is not received the way it is meant to be received, that would be most painful. This is the baggage that a translator carries. Before I go on to this, Rashmi, do I have another 5 minutes?
Yes, ma'am, you can. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
There
just
are
five
some
more.
questions, but you can continue.
Just 5 minutes, and I'm going to round off my talk. I'm telling you what has happened with this text and how difficult it was to translate at the linguistic level. At the
And there is no hurry. It's really beautiful.
Thank you, but you can't go on talking for so long. I don't know if the listeners are getting bored, but I'm sharing with you my journey about one novel. There are other novels that one has translated. I'm not talking to you about it because I want you to know that sometimes the translation activity starts off as a pretense that I can translate, I have the dictionary, I know the language, and then we move beyond all of that, right? You go beyond it, but then later on you realize, oh my God, if of 50 or 100 years from now, if this book is to live, will someone misunderstand what I have written? Have I misrepresented anything? The writer too can be misunderstood, right? But I want you to understand that the big cultural burden, the word culture is something I don't understand because, like Saussure says, it's a word that signifier and what it signifies. What is the signified for that word? We think of language as a cultural marker. But how do you negotiate all this? And how can I tell someone, hey, this is funny, this is not hurtful? This remark of you dirty Muslim is not a hurtful remark. There are so many other hurtful remarks. If you read the book, today you'll be shocked because Balbhadra Narayan Shukla is supposed to be very dark. And when he kisses that little girl, Shabnam, he has to kiss her every evening, right? When he leaves, she waits for his kiss. And when he kisses that 5-year-old girl, she wants that kiss. And after he has kissed, she rubs it off so that the darkness of his skin doesn't impact her. How would you read it today? It's say, what is wrong with Rahim Masoom Raza? Is he racist? We're going to ask those kinds of questions and we're going to miss the point completely that we cannot jump out of our shadows, that we live in our times. And I want to mention this other thing which happened in my class where I was teaching literatures in translation. So there was this particular novel that is now very controversial, Anand Mat, very popular in its own times. We had prescribed this, and we had prescribed another Bengali novel in translation, Hazar Chaursi Ki Ma, Mother of 1084. So I don't know Bengali as well, right? So you depend on the translated text. So I go to Amazon and I buy the first translation. Can you believe it? There is a translation of Anand Mat without the name of the translator. There is nothing, nowhere that you know who the translator is. I had no idea that books came out like this without any names, right? Just a publisher who's there. And somewhere there is, that this particular line has been taken from a big poet, whatever. So in this particular story, and students were very offended. The entire class felt that it was a pro-Hindu, right-wing Hindutva promoting novel. Because there is a rebellion over here by the Hindu sannyasis against the Muslim king, right? That's the story. And how the Hindus get together and energize a sleeping nation, and they fight against, they overthrow the Muslim. And there's a lot of violence in the story, and violence is shown as the method. And towards the end, peace is shown as the answer, right? So that's the story for those of you who are interested in reading it. Many of us know that the Vande Mataram is from here. Anand Mat is that novel. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is a big name, very popular, written in Bengali, became popular across India. And then I was thinking, why are my students against this book? What is it that has provoked them? Because when I did Hazar Chaursi Ki Ma, that story has a mother whose son is fighting against social inequality. He joins this guerrilla movement, which is the Naxalite movement. He is a Naxal, and my students loved him. He and his team of people, they go about killing policemen. They slash a policeman's throat. My students had no objection to that. They said that it is the right of the individual to fight against the state. But Anand Mat, they had a problem. The right of the community to overthrow a Muslim king, they had a problem with that. And that set me thinking that what is it, what is happening over here? And that's why translation is important, because there are multiple translations. This is a very weak translation. I'm not going to recommend it. I can't even tell you whose translation not to read because the name of the translator is not here. Why is it a weak translation? But despite that, I found out something, that the word country, it talks about Bengal and it says my country. This whole Anand Math, it looks like pan-Indian, but it's about Bengal. And the word for a country is the word for a village. It's the same in the Indian language. You know, you may have heard people say, "Mere desh mein, main desh ja raha hun." Desh, you know, this word desh has been translated as country. And then there is one paragraph, and I'm going to read that out to you, where the writer, right, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, I'm not defending the writer, I'm not defending the novel, I'm letting my students think through it. But you have to look at the words on the page and connect it with what is there, by what the writer had written and the times, right? So over here, the writer is one of the characters in the book is saying, how many countries are there? Magad, Mithila, Kashi, Delhi, Kashmir. These are all countries. You know, today we call them states. But here it is being called countries. And he's saying, how many countries are there? Are they in such a dire state where people are eating grass due to lack of food? You know, what he is trying to say is that it is our ruler alone who is not able to rule us. There are Muslim and British rulers across the country, various states, right? There are so many states in India, but he says so many countries, Muslims and British are ruling, but in Bengal, the Muslim king is bad. The Muslim king has made us poor. The Muslim king does not feed us. And what is the notion about that? That it's not the Muslim, right? It's the king. The king is not doing his duty. He has starved us. And therefore, we have to overthrow the king. But you know, I pointed that out to the class in a later session, and all that I got was, you know, open eyes like this and one looking at the other. But because you had not read the text, we went to the internet, right, to find out what Anand Math is all about. With that, I want to say that when you're translating a novel like the Anand Math or like Topi Shukla, you have to be so careful because it can be misread at any point in time. It's not easy. It's not just about one word and another word. It's not about cultural transference. Cultures cannot be transferred. I don't know how we will do that. But to open our eyes to some of these books, I'm going to end it with this one quotation again from Topi Shukla. In Topi Shukla, Ifan has a grandmother, Dadi. All those of you who are translators will know that in English, we don't have mama, mami, chacha, chachi, kaka, kaki, bua. We have no words, right? It's just uncle and aunt. And we have grandparents in English. We don't have a dada, dadi, nana, nani. But whereas you know that a dadi's position is higher than a nani's position, right? They're not just grandmothers. So that all those cultural elements cannot get transferred properly. So Dadi tells stories to Ifan and to other children, also to Topi Shukla. And she tells her stories like this. Children like her because this is how she tells her stories. She says, Dadi says, I don't tell you about what I have seen. I'm telling you about what I've heard. Those who tell lies are damned. But once upon a time, there was an emperor. Okay, these are her stories. So I think Topi Shukla, through Topi Shukla, Dr. Rahim Masoom Raza is telling us, I am telling you what I have seen. I am not telling you about what I've heard. This is what I've seen. And I'm not lying. All right, so that's it from me. Thank you very much. I will pause here to take your responses and to look at your questions and your own contributions. We will talk and then I will share that little bit on the workshop translation. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening, and I'm open to all your doubts, questions, thoughts, observations, whatever.
Thank you, ma'am. We have some questions which Dr. Prashita will be reading out.
And we request the other participants also to type in their questions in the chat box, and as and when we get them, we'll ask Dr. Meenakshi to please respond to it. So the first question is from Mr. Senthil, and he asks, isn't poetic language Isn't poetic language the greatest challenge to translation than prose?
May I know the name of the person who's
Mr. Mr. Senthil Kumar. Isn't poetic language the greatest challenge to translation than prose? Ma'am, you would please unmute yourself. Would you please unmute? Yeah,
I think we all got
thank you. Yeah.
muted. Right. So, Mrs. Senthil Kumar, thank you very much for the question. Translation is difficult. Prose translation also has a lot of poetry to it. Prose language, for instance, may have alliteration and we won't know what to do with it. Poetic language will have alliteration and sometimes the botheration of a rhyme, and we will never be able to rhyme it in another. If it's not an allied language, it's a little difficult to do that, but maybe within a few Indian languages, we can do it. So on the one hand, I agree with you that poetry appears to be more difficult than prose translation. On the other hand, I would think that translation per se is difficult.
Ma'am, just a follow up on that. Isn't the play of meaning a lot more complex in poetry? That is specifically the reason why I asked that question. Don't you think the play of meaning is a lot more complex when it comes to poetry?
So yes, the metaphor, the use of a metaphor, right? And you have to, when you're translating, not explain the metaphor. You can only say it, like this. And then the reader has to, whichever cultural background the reader is. Yeah, I agree with you, Senthil Kumar. It is very difficult. But if I might tell you that the play of meaning is there in a pun. For instance, in Topi Shukla, there is this use of the word Sharif, right? So what does the word Sharif mean?
Cultured, maybe.
Gentleman, maybe in Hindi?
Yeah.
Cultured, gentleman, honest, good. Yeah,
Decent.
Sharif insan hai. So he's saying nowadays you don't have Sharif. This is what he's writing, right? He says there is a Hindu Sharif, there is a Muslim Sharif, there is a Sikh Sharif, and you know what? There is Bihar Sharif. Now, Bihar Sharif is the name of a place. He just puns on this word Sharif, Hindu Sharif and Bihar Sharif. Very difficult for me to even explain what that means. I just left it as there is Bihar Sharif. Unless you know it's the name of a place, that play on the word Sharif is lost. Play of meaning in a word is lost, definitely. I agree with you. In poetry, every line you might stumble. In prose too. I think prose writers are like Wordsworth says, right? He wants to write poetry as close to prose as possible. I think good novelists write prose as close to poetry as possible.
Thank you, ma'am. We have the next question from Mr. Shubham. And he asks, if you translate Topi Shukla again in 2021, will the translation remain the same? If not, then does it mean that translation changes with time?
Yeah, so my last slide, I think, was on the reader as a translator, right? When you are the reader of the text and you belong to the 21st century, how are you receiving the text and what are you bringing to the text? Because when we look at cognitive abilities, there is something called a confirmation bias. We will look at what we want to look at. All of us come with our limited, with our conditioned sets of prejudices and our beliefs. And that's why when I showed you the first poem, why do we call God he? When the poem is not saying he, how do we take away our personality as an individual, as a reader, as a translator, away and keep it merely as a translator reflecting the text? It's so difficult because we are going to process information through us. So if I were to translate this novel again, whose question was it?
Mr. Shubham.
Mr. Shubham, I would not translate this text. I did what Pope says, right? Fools rush where angels fear to tread. When you're given the book and you're in that moment, you say, oh, I'm going to translate and do that. Now, if I know what the book is about, I'm going to say, oh, this, oh my God. Not because I love the book so much, I would not translate it. Because I know that this can be misread and misrepresented. I may not translate it, because I'm reading this book as a Hindu today. I didn't read it 22 years ago. I was a reader. And the writer was a writer. He was a big writer. He was Rahim Asum Raza. Today I'm asking, why is Rahim Asum Raza not able to show a Hindu family? Why is he able to show us only a Muslim family? But look, here is a writer who's trying to tell us that Topi and Ifan are the same people. They are two sides of a coin. You know, despite that, I am going to ask these questions. I am going to ask him, where are the women in your novel? Can you see the identity politics which has crowded us so much that we are not able to read a book for what it is, and we will punish the writer for what he has written. So I don't know whether I'll translate it again this time, if I were given a chance, but I'm sure that the translation may be a little different. Yes, my biases have changed.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shubham.
All right, the next question is from Ms. Minoti. And she asks, do you think it is possible to translate humor and retain the same flavor as that of the original language? Do you think it would evoke the same response?
The answer is no. Single line answer is no. Can't tell a person it's a joke unless they realize it's a joke, right? Look at how I had to tell you this is a funny dialogue happening in the book. So if you're not able to read that and you don't get the tone, there is this a particular memoir written by Shashi Deshpande, which is called Listen to Me. Now that's the title of the book. Books and words don't have that tone. So I remember someone telling me that, what is this? Listen to me. It sounded like that. But that's not the tone in the book. The tone in the book is, please listen to me. Please, you know, that please is missing in the title. But how do you get that tone? It's an appeal. That, look, I have something to say, please listen to me. That's the tone. But if you're reading just the title of the book, you may get the meaning. So jokes, no. They don't know. There are the translators who have their experiences of translating jokes. It's very tough.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Minoti.
All right, the next person is Mr. Sujit Chandak. And he asks, what makes the translator of literary texts decide upon what he or she is going to translate?
Sujit, so happy to hear from you, Sujit. I didn't know you were here. Sujit is an ex-colleague from SNDT. So what's that question, Sujit, that how do you choose a book to translate?
What?
How do you know this is the book you want to translate?
I don't think he's here. What makes the translator of literary texts decide upon what he or she is going to translate? Seems so. Choice of the book to be translated.
You like a book very much and then you translate it, or you're commissioned to translate something, so you translate it. Or you have nothing else to do, so you think you're translating, you'll do some translation, you know, you translate. But if it's a passion with you, you really want to share that particular text or similar kinds of text to a wider audience, if that is your mission, then you choose pretty much whatever text is available to be translated. Like I would say, Topi Shukla should be translated into every Indian language. And one should attempt it. So whatever you like, especially if you like very much, you should. You know, if you're translating 7 Habits of Effective Leadership by Stephen Covey, you may not have to struggle much. But if you're writing, I wonder how Leo Tolstoy was translated. Who were those people who could translate tomes and tomes? So my Topi Shukla is about 128 pages. It took me over a year and a half. I thought 1 page a day, I'll finish it in 130 days. It doesn't work like that at all. So someone who's translated a Leo Tolstoy, they just love Leo Tolstoy, I think, to have been able to translate it. Orhan Pamuk has very good translators, and people in Turkey say that he's not one of their top 10 writers. But those of us who read in English think of him as a very great writer because that translator has done a great service to him, likes him, and has done it. So I think, Sujit, simple answer, translate what you like.
The next question is from Ms. Sunita Bajaj, and she's asked, it's true that a translated text can change the perception of readers. So can we call it a good translation or a deviation from the source text?
Difficult, right? What is a good translation? I don't know what a good translation is. Sometimes, Sunita, the original text is also filled with mistakes. Topi Shukla in Hindi is filled with mistakes. But I was too naive not to point it out. I accepted the original as, the original. I didn't realize that that also had an editor who could have polished the book up, taken away the mistakes. So in that sense, there is that original book. And then there is the translator's book, the translator's version. I would think a translated text is a version, right? It's what Plato would have said, Socrates would have said, one more step removed, one more step removed. But for the reader, it's like two veils that you uncover. You uncover the veil of the translator, you uncover the veil of the author, and then you approach the text. So there is a text in which there is meaning that can be uncovered. And I think you have to go beyond the translator and the original writer, Sunita, to be able to.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita.
Thank you.
Ma'am, would you want to move on to the next session now?
Yeah, there are some people who have written to me as a direct message, but there are no questions here. And I'm not able to see the question. So I think that's how it has been. I'll share the last bit. You tell me, Rashmi and Prasita, what's a good way to do this. What I have put over here are titles that can be shared, right? Can be translated. So this is for people who wish to translate. If you want to do something right now, let's translate book titles. Anyone who would like to translate The Inheritance of Loss into any language of your choice. How do you translate this? See, when it's a name like Topi Shukla, you retain it. Though the meaning of Topi is lost, you still retain it, right? So many of Charles Dickens's novels, if they're named after a character, easy to translate the title. Anyone who wants to try, would like to unmute and try? Or the next one, The Catcher in the Rye. This is what I meant when I said if there's a metaphor, it's difficult. The metaphor need not necessarily be only in a poem. Simpler one, The Reluctant Fundamental. You can do this, right? You can have fun doing it. You can do the Game of Thrones. It's easier to translate the Game of Thrones, the title. And here is one poem. It's by Walt Whitman. Does anyone want to try translating it? Because when you try that is when you will know where you're getting stuck. I can share the PowerPoint with Rashmi and she can share it with the others, but endlessly we can pick up. The first paragraph of Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities, so popular in English. Try putting it into a language of your choice and figure out where you stumble. One will be with words, right? Not just equivalent words, but is there a word at all? And what is that closest word? And then choices. There's always an editor who will tell you not this, not that, because I've had so many of these very frustrating moments when the editor looks at it from a distance. You need that editor to look at it and you're saying, no, but I want it like this. This is how it is. For instance, in a Premchand story that I translated, there was a line which said, उन्होंने देखा मगर बंद आंखों से. So they saw that person मगर बंद आंखों से. ठीक है. So I wrote it as they saw it, but with closed eyes. Very literal. But I wanted it like that because I thought that that sticks to the meter. Dekha, magar, they saw, but, so that remains over there, that kind of a meter to the word. And in Hindi, there is a phrase, dekhe ko andekha karna. And the writer has not used that phrase. So I didn't want to use an equivalent in English, right? I wanted to stick to the original, but that got edited. And the editor used the English phrase. All right. So that's about it from me. So if there are other people who are translators over here and who would like to comment on their own experiences or share some things, I'd be very happy to hear that. May I stop sharing screen, Rashmi?
Ma'am, actually, some people are trying to attempt those
Oh, lovely, lovely.
titles.
Okay.
It's in the chat box. You can see some of those responses. So, for example, the inheritance of loss.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It says Ghate ki Varisi.
Yeah, good. Good. Yeah, that's nice. But which language is that? In Hindi? Ghate ki Varisi. Okay. Is Ghata a Hindi word?
Mayank, is it in Hindi?
Ghate mein jana is a very colloquial word, but good one, yeah. Varisi is nice. Varisi is a good word. Good turn. Then anybody else? Any other language?
You can type your answers into the chat box to everyone because now the chat box is open. If you like. Ma'am, can you see the chat box? The
No,
message.
I can't because I'm sharing the screen. Can I?
Okay.
Yes,
please.
ma'am. You could
All
show.
right. Thank you. Oh, this is a nice French translation that I have got, but that's like English and French are sister languages. Vinayaki has a question. What should be prioritized while translating to preserve the depth and cultural value while translating or to prioritize the conveyance? I think they're very connected, Vinayaki. When you are conveying an underlying idea, you are preserving the depth and the cultural value of the text. They are not separate issues. You can't have one and not the other. That's my view. You can challenge it, I'm sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anybody else who's a translator here? Apart from the speaker for tomorrow.
There's something in Malayalam written here. Marathi.
What's it in Malayalam? Because I didn't get it. Oh, there are so many things that I have missed.
The one in the, would you like to unmute and read it?
It's read as നഷ്ടങ്ങളുടെ പിന്തുടർച്ച അവകാശം.
Okay. I'll take you at your word.
Ma'am, shall I read in Marathi, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Marathi मावळणारा वारसा.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good. But it's a little difficult, right, to get the right word and to get it like that.
Yes,
when
ma'am.
you have titles like this, you have to have all the words with you.
Ma'am, we have a question from Ms. Akansha, and she asks, how do we inculcate the interest of translation while teaching kids? I presume kids would be in school or college. I don't know if you could just specify the level, then maybe Ms. Akansha.
In any case, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Akanksha, are you saying something?
No.
Right. So my answer, how do you inculcate the interest of translation, is for me, it's not, I'm not translating a chemistry book, right? So I'm not interested in that kind of a translation. I'm interested in translating stories, and my interest will be in the story. It is not in the translation. That translation is so secondary. So how do I inculcate that interest is by telling those kids those stories. Whoever those kids are, they could be 80-year-old kids. I'll tell them the story and I'll tell them, hey, if you want more, why don't you translate? Why don't you read up? Or why don't you share what is best in your own culture and your own stories or your own linguistic background? So I might push them like that, but I would share the joy of the story. Like for me today, I'll answer the other question. Is it necessary to apply theories at the time of translating? So Faisal, when you are studying in a college, then theory is taught, right? And then you will say Sujit Mukherjee said this and Susan Bassnett said that. And then you get a question on how do you get that. That is a limited way of translating, but that's how it works in the academia. When you are translating on your own, because we have this history of translation which is available to us, it is okay to know a little bit of what am I doing, right? Am I doing a free flow translation or am I doing a word-to-word translation? All these are words and concepts that you will be introduced to in a theory classroom. You can junk it and you can do it your way, but you can also use theory to stop making the kinds of mistakes that other people have made in the past. So that you know that this option is available because of theory. So you don't have to apply theories at the time of translating, but if it is available to you and you can access them, good to know. Good to know. It's like some clothes that you're wearing, right? There is a better kind of a design that is available for the same price, go for it. Shubda, to what extent would it be acceptable to provide a glossary at the end of it? So Shubda, a glossary is so important because many words cannot be translated. And we have had this history, footnoting has happened. And then footnoting, you footnote a word like roti, and then you call it a flat leavened bread or something like that. So I would suggest that we have done enough of this work in the past for us today to assume and take it for granted that roti does not need a footnote or a glossary. If you don't understand roti, too bad. Okay, because you may have read texts in English which have had so many phrases in French and in Latin, and nobody gave us footnotes for that, right? Nobody gave us footnotes because they assumed that if you knew English, you also knew French. But now I think it's time for us, because we have about 30 to 40 years of a translation study in India. Good for us now to say pallu. No need to explain the word pallu. And to have odd kinds of phrases that come up. No need to explain the word roti. No, I don't think there is a need. But if there are some words, kinship terms or keywords, which cannot be understood, you have to give it a glossary. In my own novel translation of Topi Shukla, the last line of the story is the word fahisha. And the last line says, Topi's father said, fahisha. Now that's my tone, right? Fahisha. And Topi's mother doesn't know what that word means. And the last line of the novel is, Topi was like fahisha. The mother didn't understand Topi at all. So I have not given the meaning of the word fahisha, because we don't need to know the meaning of the word fahisha. What we need to know is that you can't understand. Topi cannot be understood even by his mother. So I didn't give a footnote to that, but there were many other words that I did footnote, and there was a glossary. So I think a glossary helps. No harm in having that. I don't know if you'd agree, but that's my view. Ma'am, would you suggest to the beginners to translate from mother tongue to English or English to mother tongue? So I'm assuming you're young, Preeti, in the sense of you're a student, undergraduate or postgraduate student, and that's young for me. Is that many people don't know their mother tongues. Many people don't know English. Many of us don't know many languages. So if there are 2 languages that you think you are competent in, please go ahead. My mother tongue is Tamil, and I unfortunately, very unfortunately, I cannot translate from Tamil into English. So Hindi is my language and I can translate from Hindi into English. I understand Marathi, but I can't translate Marathi into English. I cannot translate from English into Hindi. So whichever two languages you are comfortable with, please go on. Abhinav, are you my student Abhinav or some other Abhinav? Ma'am, if we don't find equivalent phrases while translating an English text to Hindi, do we opt for the closest substitute? Yes. Or retain the original? All right, the reluctant fundamentalist has Anmana Kattarvadi. Kattarvadi is a fun. Anmana, is there a word like that? Anmana? Mayank Jha, but it sounds very beautiful. Do we need permission from the author to translate a work? No, but if you're publishing that translation, then you need it. If you're publishing that translation, then you need the author's permission. Arya Avakashi, used in your translation, refers to a person who inherited and not. Oh, so this is Senthil Kumar's correction of one Look there, you translate one set of words and somebody already tells you that no.
Just a feedback.
Yeah, I know, it's good. It's very good. This is how I'm saying that, it's just a line and then we realize that, hey, there is something more to what I have translated. It's very good. I'm congratulating you, Senthil, for pointing that out because only someone who knows the language can show that. Okay, anything else over here? So there's so much French, Amanda. I'm sorry, I won't be able to respond to that.
There is a question from Tanushree Garg. She's asked, do translations have to be in 2 different languages?
How else then? Old English to New English is also a translation. Yeah. So if it is from a language which was in the past to that same language as it is used now, you could do it. How does one begin with translating a book in the first place, Aparna? Is there a book that you like very much? Do you want others to know about that book? Then translate the first line of the book. Just go ahead, pen and paper. No need to, good not to type it in, and a lot of us work with the keyboard. Good to keep pen and paper because then when you cancel out something, you will see the process. You have to see your drafts to see the change. If you simply delete it on screen, you'll not have that history of the draft that you have made, all the drafts that you have had.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, it's a colloquial word, anmana. Okay, all right. Ma'am, what about the formalities involved in translation? Perhaps we need to take their permission. Yes, if you're publishing it, then there are the formalities and usually the publisher will take charge of that. So if you want to publish, you first need a publisher and then the publisher writes to the author. Usually what works here is the other way around, that the publisher decides with the author that the book needs to be published and then they choose their translator. They commission their translators. I think, Rashmi, it's already 5. People have been very patient and very kind. I can't believe it. Thank you for all your questions. I'm okay to wait, right? I'm all right, absolutely, to wait and talk. But don't hold anyone.
Ma'am, can I ask something?
Yes, of course. Of course.
Ma'am, just now you mentioned that if it is in the same language, it's like intralingual, isn't it? So wouldn't it be called rewording or paraphrasing rather than translation?
No, if you are translating, then it is a translation, right? If you're paraphrasing, then that you're paraphrasing, right? You're summarizing. That's different. But if we are going to rewrite Shakespeare from his kind of a language to the kind of a language that is available now, we would call it a translation.
Okay.
It's a version, yes.
Thank you.
So you see, when it is a text, it's easy to talk about translation. But when it is oral literature, what is that original text? And how do we translate?
Yeah.
Who are we translating?
That's right.
There's so many of these complexities that come when you're translating a text which you didn't know was a text. Manusmriti is a text. We really first want to know whether Manusmriti was a text. And who are you translating? So that original, what is that original is also an important idea. But with most 18th, 19th, 20th century books, there are these books, they are published, the name of the publisher is there, the name of the poet is there, the name of the author, everything is available, date of publication. So those books should be easy to get hold of and translate without that other complexity involved.
Okay, there are no more questions. I don't know, because I can see a lot of questions coming in, but we could probably also email them to you, and if you could respond, we could send them to the participants. I'm very grateful for this session, and I'm actually very happy to see a lot of our colleagues from other colleges, students from other colleges also participating along with our own in-house faculty and students. I'd like to now invite our student Maria Norona to propose the vote of thanks.
Hello, am I audible?
Maria, you'll have to be a little more loud.
Okay. Hello, am I audible now?
Yes, Maria.
A very good evening to all. As all good things come to an end, so is the first day of the webinar on Introduction to Translation Studies, organized by the Department of English of St. Xavier's College. As a member of the student committee, I, Maria Narona from FIBA Division A, am honored to propose the vote of thanks. At the outset, I thank our resource person, Dr. Meenakshi Shivram. We are grateful for your presence. We are immensely happy to have learned from your experience and your expertise as a translator. Thank you for accepting our invitation and gracing this webinar with your sublime presence. It was indeed a privilege to listen to you. Thank you, ma'am. We are very thankful to our rector, Dr. Father Keith D'Souza, and our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde. Sir, thank you for sharing your valuable time with us. We are grateful for the support received from our Vice Principal, Dr. Karune Gokran, Vice Principal of Academics, Dr. Anuparna, Vice Principal for Arts, and Dr. Rishikesh Samant, Vice Principal for Science. We are thankful to the constant support provided by the RUSA team to organize this webinar cum workshop. A warm thank you to the Department of English and the faculty members, Dr. Pearl Pastakia, the head of department, Dr. Rashmi George, and Dr. Sita Mukherjee, under whose guidance this webinar was made possible. We are also thankful to our office staff who helped us with all the paperwork. A heartfelt thanks to our lovely audience for your active participation. We are very happy to note the presence of our alumni, faculty friends from neighboring colleges, and all the new friends we made through this webinar. A warm note of thanks to our core student team, which includes me, Stuti from FIBA Division C, and Sahil from SYBA. A special thanks to each and every member of the organizing committee for their unflinching cooperation and coordination, and to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to the successful execution of this webinar. We would like to add that on February 17th, 2021, we have another RUSA-sponsored webinar called Mindfulness Through Literature. You're most welcome to participate in it. On this note, we move to the end of today's seminar. Thank you and see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, Rashmi, Pearl, and Prasita. Thank you very much, all of you, and for the warmth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rashmi. Sita. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, ma'am. It was a lovely session. Really had a good time. It was, there were lots of questions.
Lots to learn. Lots to learn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Senthil Kumar. Where are you from?
I'm from Kerala.
Okay. How did you know about this seminar?
I think from some Telegram or WhatsApp group related to academics. I'm a member, so I came to know just like that.
Oh, that's so nice. Are you also teaching somewhere?
Yes, I teach English at a law college in Kerala.
Wow, wonderful. much for joining in and also for your
Yes, ma'am. It's great meeting you. Hopefully, we'll meet sometime somewhere.
Yeah, it's nice to know people from so many different places have joined in it. It just makes it all the more rich.
Yeah, thanks
Definitely.
for this format, right? We can have many people and make it
Yeah.
possible to talk to so many people. That's nice. Thank you for arranging it, all of you at the English department at St. Xavier's College, and do come to Christ University.
Thank you. Thank you so
We
much.
also hope to invite you to some of our functions.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
For the interesting session.
Thank you. I hope it was useful. Because I wasn't talking about the act of translating, mostly about the burden of translating.
But your illustrations were very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. Can we log off?
Yes, ma'am. I thought maybe we could just chat.
Yeah, I would be happy to talk actually.
Yeah, we could. I mean, I was just hanging around for that.
I'd be very happy to talk. It's just that I sometimes feel, am I holding you up?
No, you're not.
Please feel free to go whenever you wish to.
If I may say something, ma'am.
Yes.
It was a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Oh, who is this? I get.
My name is Sudha Krishnan, though it reflects as Krishnan.
Yes. And where are you from, Sudha?
Bombay. I'm currently pursuing my master's in English from the distance education IDOL, Mumbai University.
Okay.
And after a break of almost 38 years, actually, I did my BA in 1983.
Wow.
It is. And when I heard you today, it is a super wow, actually.
That's very kind of you. That's very kind of you. But I want to wish you all the very best because that's
Thank you so much.
Brave and so valuable, your decision.
It is. I just realized that I'm enjoying it so much more now than I did when I actually was doing my bachelor's. As you said, you know, the perspective changes so much.
Absolutely. You know, the books that I read when I was doing my literature course, the books that I was studying, and then when I reread those books, I'm able to see. I was telling someone about, you know, reading Jude the Obscure is so different today from when I read it so many years ago. So
very true, very true.
Writers and their minds.
Correct. I remember we had Mr. Derek Anta, who was the head of the English department at that time.
SIS College, I was in SIS College and Derek Anta was my professor.
Actually, you look very familiar. I don't know. I knew an Anuradha Shivram, but not a Meenakshi Shivram.
And I don't know Anuradha Shivram. So.
Okay. So perhaps you must have passed out a bit earlier.
Oh dear, so long ago. Let me figure out. 1981.
Yeah, a couple of years my senior, I guess.
So many years, right? Oh my God.
True. Yes, Derek Anta was amazing, actually.
Yeah, so we owe so much to our teachers.
Really.
Hello, Meenakshi ma'am.
Yes.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Usha. Yes, Usha from Maharashtra. Ma'am, I am very much thankful to you. Even I heard it's very interesting and informative session, really. And my daughter, who is 8 years old, she was also listening to you and she was also appreciating to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Usha.
Thank you, ma'am.
Oh, that is so sweet. The beginner translator.
You're very sweet.
Okay. I can't see you, but I'm sure you're also very sweet.
Thanks, ma'am.
Yes, beta. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
Thank you. So do you all teach, do you have a paper on translation and how to translate?
No, actually, we don't have a paper. But there are texts. I think Prashita and perhaps Pearl might be able to tell you because they do Indian writing in
Indian literature,
Ex- if I may just add in, for MA Part 2, we do have a paper in Indian literature in translation. Mumbai University paper 8 is Indian literature in translation. So it's very, it was very useful to me, and I really like an eye opener. In a very short span, you took us through the entire paper, sort of. Now when I open my book, I'm sure I'll be able to understand much better.
For TYBA, paper 6 also has an option of translation studies. They have grammar, culture studies, and translation studies as well.
You're planning to introduce a paper or two on translation studies for our MA course. Right now, it's very nascent, but we thought it'd be nice to have a skill-based paper.
Yeah, the stumbling block is always evaluation. When you tell them translate from English into Oriya, and who is that person to tell us whether it's a good Oriya translation? Or if it's from Oriya into English, how are we to even know?
Thank you for alerting us to that. We thought of selecting, having only a few languages, selecting translation studies to be guided by professors proficient in translations from just a handful of languages.
Yes, but the students must be familiar with that language.
Yes. Then it would only work as an elective.
Yes.
Thank you.
Work as an elective, yes. That's the stumbling block for, otherwise you end up just doing theory, right? And then you tell them to. But you can always get outside expertise, whatever the language, you can send it to somebody else to figure out. If they like it, and an elective is always a good idea, then they are able to figure out whether they want it or not.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we will leave now, and we will try and catch up again soon. Some format or the other. I'd really like to log in tomorrow if possible to listen to that lecture. And again, later when you have in February that other session, if time permits, I'd really try and log in as well. Yeah, because I'm interested in mindfulness and literature. That is what Rashmi wanted me to talk about, and I couldn't. So I will definitely listen into that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All the best to all of you.
See you tomorrow. I'll send you the link for tomorrow's talk as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So I'll probably, I'll maybe end the session. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tomorrow. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.